Just a little background on the social location of the author, Robin Wall Kimmerer. This was adapted from her bio. She identifies as a mother, a scientist, a botanist in particular. She's a distinguished teaching professor of environmental biology at the university where she works at in Syracuse, New York. She's the founder and director of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, also in Syracuse. She's an enrolled and active member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. The Potawatomi are a part of the Three Fires Council, composed of 3 indigenous groups, the other 2 being the Ojibwe, the Keepers of the Faith, and the Odawa, the Keepers of the Trade. Potawatomi are considered the Keepers of the Fire.
In the settler mind, land was property, real estate, capital, or natural resources. But to our people, it was everything. Identity, the connection to our ancestors, the home of our non-human kinfolk, our pharmacy, our library, the source of all that sustained us. Robin Wall Kimmerer, Braiding Sweetgrass. Cornell Law School provides the definition of settler colonialism as a system where colonizers come to stay, permanently displacing or eliminating indigenous populations to establish a new, self-sustaining society on stolen land. This process involves systemic land theft, cultural erasure, and assimilation policies like residential schools or forced integration, and ongoing domination, creating structures that benefit settlers at the expense of indigenous rights and sovereignty, often rooted in ideologies of racial superiority. White supremacist ideals are often in direct antithesis to what indigenous teachings and practices were held before. A few examples include stewardship versus land ownership. In the indigenous practice, there is a recognition of humanity's impermanence and an understanding that we are responsible for stewarding the earth from generation to generation. Land does not belong to one person, but to the earth herself. Under the white supremacist patriarchy, land and nature are subjugated and depleted of their resources to maximize profit, actively disregarding what will be left for future generations. Collectivism versus individualism. Collectivism believes that community is more than the sum of its pieces and asks the central question, what do we owe each other? Individualism within white supremacy mistakenly assumes that we all exist independently and unaffected by the systems and people around us. In the American context, it is the basis for the ideal you have to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. A phrase co-opted from its original meaning, which meant something impossible or absurd. Indigenous teachings also honor and represent cultural autonomy within the community, while white supremacist ideals are focused on assimilation. The focus of the assimilation is to eradicate the culture, tradition, and practice of the outside group and force a consistent identity in a society for ease of control. For Native Americans, this ideal resulted in the removal of the Native populations to reservations, the criminalizations of their languages and cultural practices, and the removal of their children to residential schools. White supremacy is often really concerned and tied to the idea of positional authority and hierarchy, while within indigenous teachings, the importance is put on the relationship between two people. Indigenous practice believes in the reciprocity within relationships as the foundational tenet of community. Without the commitment to each other, you cannot build a relationship as equals. In white supremacy, hierarchy and positional authority are the basis of society and function to keep society together through status and fear. A person's value is based on who holds power over them and who they hold power over. Slide 16. In indigenous agriculture, the practice is to modify the plants to fit the land. As a result, there are many varieties of corn domesticated by our ancestors, all adapted to grow in different places. Modern agriculture, with its big engines and fossil fuels, took the opposite approach: modify the land to fit the plants, which are frighteningly similar clones. Robin Wall Kimmerer.
As Nicole mentioned in the previous slide, reciprocity within relationships, both to the land and the community, was fundamental to Indigenous practice and the common thread through braiding sweetgrass. Gratitude as a radical act. Kimmerer uses the Native American legend of Wendigo, a monster born of insatiable hunger, as a cautionary tale of modern consumerism and the loss of reciprocity. The Wendigo mindset reflects the colonial consumer versus a mindset of reciprocity that was valued by the Native Americans. This contrast of mindsets can be seen as follows. The colonial settler viewpoint of scarcity, that there is never enough and one must conquer to gain more resource sources, versus the Indigenous perspective of abundance, that the earth will always provide when we practice good stewardship. The viewpoint of land, colonial settler view of land as property and as an individual right, versus the Indigenous perspective of being in relationship with the land or other people, that there is always a giver and a receiver, which creates a cycle of gratitude. Consumer versus active gratitude. The colonial settler identity is defined by domination, accumulation, and ownership, whereas the Indigenous perspective of the world is one of a gift economy, that we are a participant in our relationship with the land. And this sense of responsibility and relationship shifts the mindset of consumerism to one of gratitude. And ultimately, it is this gratitude that defeats the Wendigo monster. Reciprocity as the Three Sisters. Kimmerer presents the idea of the Three Sisters as a blueprint for the world, a map of balance and harmony, as a means for advancing beyond the detrimental effects of colonialism. Traditionally, the Three Sisters were a grouping of corn, beans, and squash. In its physical manifestation of reciprocity, each plant provides exactly what the others lack. The corn provides a natural trellis for beans to climb, while the beans fix nitrogen to the soil to allow for fertilization, and the sprawling squash leaves act as a living mulch to retain moisture and suppress the weeds. The Three Sisters exemplifies the concept that each plant or person holds the responsibility for mutual flourishing of the other, that the group as a whole thrives better together than the individual alone. This concept is contrary to the colonialist perspective that individuals are entitled and inherently separate from the community and land. Reciprocity as the honorable harvest. Contrary to the colonial perspective of take everything, Kimmerer, in accordance to Indigenous philosophy on sustainability, introduces a set of underlying rules for taking from the earth called the honorable harvest. This includes asking permission before taking. We are acknowledging the sovereignty of all things. Never take the first, never take the last. This is rooted in respectful harvesting to allow for propagation. Take only what you need and minimize harm when taking, and give a gift of gratitude in return. This gift of gratitude continues the cycle of reciprocity.
Going into the honorable harvest a bit more, Kimmerer says, the guidelines for the honorable harvest are not written down or even consistently spoken of as a whole. They are reinforced in small acts of daily life. But if you were to list them, they might look something like this. Feel free to go through and read some of these. They're really beautiful and can spark some thought onto how we can use small acts to embed reciprocity in our lives. I'm going to look at a couple of them in my next slide on what reciprocity requires. Just a few things where I was able to pull out was responsibility, justice, and gratitude. So looking at responsibility, the Honorable Harvest teaches that responsibility extends beyond the present moment and it begins before action. So there are longitudinal results of gratitude, and it can actually begin before, in that sweet spot between making a decision and acting. So 2 of these aspects came from the Honorable Harvest. Don't take the first and don't take the last. My interpretation was that the first is a sign of abundance, not necessarily an invitation to take. So having a pause before claiming knowledge, claiming that you know something about the source of this, or that you're entitled to taking it. Listen before speaking. In the Honorable Harvest, the wise ancestors recommended asking permission, listening. And I thought these also applied outside of a harvest situation, can apply to colonialism, or if you're, talking with someone that you're not super familiar with, familiarizing yourself with the context of your understanding and access. And that also means with your lack of understanding, or could be lack of access either, but just giving yourself a context of what you are taking or receiving. Connecting it to colonialism, those with more power are often positioned to take first. They might have access, they might have privilege, which allows them to gain access first, which then means marginalized individuals and communities are often the ones who are left with what remains. And then the inverse, don't take the last. By not taking the last, it ensures long-term continuity and regeneration of a population, of a species, of a particular crop. And it values long-term continuity over short-term gain. And by not taking the last, it's also leaving space for others to take, especially those from marginalized communities and those with less access. Those with greater privilege, access, opportunity, etc., they have the higher capacity to take. So they also have more responsibility to refrain. Looking at justice, there was a presentation that Kimura gave on reciprocity through Braiding Sweetgrass. And one of this quote was from her presentation. Justice is giving the precise equivalent of what he has received. Kimura discusses justice as a social construct that's informed by culture, not something that's biologically inherent to human beings. So different cultures think differently about what constitutes justice and wrongdoing. The culture that Kimura comes from views violations of justice and community standards as violations of balance. So in instances of wrongdoing, the focus is not on the offense, but it's more so on the offender and the offended, the relationship between those two, and how you can foster healing between them. So by taking the emphasis off of the offense, but instead focusing on the humans, it actually can foster more restoration, more healing, and therefore more justice. So my question was, what would it look like if we used this humanistic approach within our own justice system? This next slide was a couple examples of how we see this humanistic approach. I wish there were an abundance of examples, but these are just 2. I came across this Quilters documentary a couple weeks ago, and it's just about a group of men in a prison maximum security prison, who are a part of this restorative justice quilting program. And it's only 30 minutes. You can truly see the impacts and the healing effects of focusing on the humans involved. In this documentary, they don't even talk about the offense. It's not even a part of these people's identities in this particular context. And you can see how empowering that is. And I just thought it was a really beautiful example. And then this was an article I came across a while ago too about this new program at a prison in Maine, which allows inmates to have remote jobs while incarcerated. And it offers a ton of opportunity, redemption, dignity in exchange for meaningful labor and a contribution to society. These people come out of their incarceration with some savings a lot of the time. It's just an example of what could be put in place with a little more thought to healing and restoration. And then the last piece of what reciprocity requires is gratitude. This quote I thought was powerful. Sometimes in return for the gifts of the earth, gratitude is enough. It is our uniquely human gift to express thanks because we have the awareness and collective memory to remember that the world could well be otherwise, less generous than it is. But I think we are called to go beyond cultures of gratitude to once again become cultures of reciprocity. So here, it's reminding us that gratitude is enough sometimes, but the next step is engaging in reciprocal relationships and making sure that there's balance between giving and taking. Because gratitude can also just end pretty abruptly. You can give thanks and appreciation and move on. But the ways in which you give thanks and appreciation should come from a mutual relationship of care. The moral covenant of reciprocity calls us to honor our responsibilities for all we have been given, for all that we have taken.
Moving on to where reciprocity is broken, Kimmerer touches on this subject throughout the book, and we'll focus on, for this slide, where reciprocity is broken with land. The quote here reads, "We have enjoyed the feast generously laid out for us by Mother Earth. But now the plates are empty and the dining room is a mess. It's time we started doing the dishes in Mother Earth's kitchen." Kimmerer warns that if we fail to change course now, we risk being abandoned by the natural world, leading to what she calls an estrangement from the rest of creation. Throughout the book, she touches on how many acts by governments and localities have really damaged the natural world. And, she pleads that we start trying to fix our relationship with the natural world since we've created so much damage. According to the NOAA, 2024 was the warmest year on record since global records began in 1850. We are also seeing lots of upticks in catastrophic weather patterns that deeply affect our natural world and environments. Kimmerer notes that spring comes a week earlier than 20 years ago, disrupting maple syrup production that our tribe has long sourced from the forests. The impacts we're feeling from global warming are already real, and without action, we risk creating irreversible damage to our environments locally. She touches on throughout the book how her tribe has sourced maple syrup from the forest, and with global warming now occurring, it's becoming harder to source the maple syrup, and it's harder to predict with all these erratic weather patterns that are happening. So she pleads that, us as humans and governments, and localities, that we must try to repair this relationship with nature because we risk creating lots of damage to animals, to the environment, and to ourselves that may be irreversible. Moving on to the next slide of where reciprocity is broken, we focus on labor. A quote from the book says, "It's funny how the nature of an object, let's say a strawberry or a pair of socks, is so changed by the way it comes into your hands, either as a gift or as a commodity." Kimmerer touches on how gift-giving is described as like an act of love and effort, making the exchange personal and rooted in connection between others. rather than monetary value. In contrast, capitalist society disconnects us from this process by encouraging purchase gifts that often lack personal meaning or intention. Throughout the book, Kimmerer really hones in on how, Indigenous cultures really focus on, creating a gift for someone else. And it's an act of love when they give this gift to someone. And, I think oftentimes in our society, capitalism, companies like Amazon and huge stores, we're kind of lost in this cycle, that Indigenous peoples use to kind of show love and show effort for another human being. We can just go to a store or click on, a website and just have something ordered. So the process is very informal, and it's not really personal. It really lacks a lot of the meaning and intention that otherwise would go into creating a gift. Another quote that really focuses on labor and where reciprocity is broken is rather than the value of the goods being exchanged. Native Americans value relationships of other people, exchanging with participants in an economy by collecting personal debts rather than material wealth. From the Virginia's Encyclopedia, in contrast with our capitalist commodity exchanges, which center on buying and selling goods at marketplaces, or big stores, websites. A gift economy model fosters deep connections and emphasizes relationships and reciprocity. There's, many examples in the book where, Kimmerer is, engaging in the process of creating gifts, learning the process of how to create like a basket was one example, and the time and effort that goes into it, and the respect that one has to have for nature when creating a gift, because a lot of times they would source these things from the land, from the forests, and they had a lot of respect for the materials that they were sourcing, and the process of creating the gift. It wasn't easy to create a lot of these gifts, but through time, effort, and patience, they were able to create something that was long-lasting and had a lot of meaning. Finally, where reciprocity is broken, we will focus on knowledge. A quote from the book: Indigenous ways of knowing, we understand a thing only when we understand in all four aspects of our being: mind, body, emotion, and spirit. I came to understand quite sharply, this is Kimmerer talking, when I began my training as a scientist, that science privileges only one or possibly two of those ways of knowing, the mind and body. This quote really embodies, a lot of the lessons that she wants to kind of give in this book, that, Indigenous knowledge, Native American knowledge is very important. And just because it is not, I guess in some ways can lack like a scientific empirical basis, it's still a valid form of interpreting the world and interpreting, how we can understand, our connection to the land, connection to, animals and our natural world. As we move on, Kimmerer explains that Indigenous cultures embrace, multiple ways of understanding the world that the rigid frameworks of science often overlooks. During her career, she encountered scientific fields that dismissed Indigenous knowledge as lacking empirical grounding. But her work shows that integrating these perspectives can expand our overall understanding. Currently, Native American knowledge is being applied in practices such as prescribed burns, herbal medicines, and wildlife management. Drawing on, this long-standing knowledge helps repair our relationship with the natural world and protect vulnerable ecosystems. one message she really wanted, to kind of get through in the book was that, Native American knowledge is a valid way of, interacting with the world and healing the world. Herbal medicines are something that, a lot of people use. You can go online and find herbal medicine recipes, instead of buying, something that's, created in a lab or pharmaceutical. Prescribed burns, I think in Colorado especially, they're very useful, in areas where we're susceptible to wildfires, to try to, mitigate some of, the dangers that wildfires can pose, especially in dry areas like, Colorado. And wildlife management too. It's kind of respecting our relationship with animals and the natural world. And, Native Americans have long used, different practices on managing wildlife and not taking more than what they need. I think that's another lesson that Kimmerer really wants to shine through with Native American knowledge, is that they only take as much as they need, and they don't want to take too much, from the natural world, because that can really hurt the natural process. And I think that's, a lot of these lessons are very, very good pieces of knowledge, for us to kind of, understand ourselves, and understand nature, and, continually try to respect our relationship that we have with the natural world.
To wrap up our presentation on settler colonialism and Indigenous perspectives through grading Sweetgrass, some questions that we came up with as a group for further reflection were: where do you see reciprocity in your daily life? Discuss a current issue where you see reciprocity interrupted. Describe how reciprocity can benefit the social worker-client relationship. And maybe you can think of some ways that you can commit to small acts of gratitude in your life to foster community and reciprocity. This one final quote from Braiding Sweetgrass, talks about some ways that we can do this. You can read the whole thing yourself, but Kimmerer says we could do it through gratitude, through ceremony, through land stewardship, science, art, and in everyday acts of practical reverence. So this sparked some good conversation with the group about the ways that we see it in ceremony and ritual and tradition. In the book, they talk about how one of her relatives dumps out some coffee onto the earth every morning in order to express reverence and gratitude for the bounty of coffee. So maybe you can think of some other ways that you, even through small acts, see reciprocity and gratitude show up in your lives, or how you could improve that. And then lastly, we just have our references. So thank you all for taking the time to see our presentation.